My name's Dr. Emma Cavell. I'm a lecturer of medieval history at the University of Leeds, and I work on Anglo-Norman history, the history of the British Isles and women. Today I want to look at the question of why Henry II was able to hold on to his Angevin territories, particularly the territories in France, and his son King John not. Now, we've all heard tales about bad King John and all the things he did wrong, and how he compares unfavourably to his brother Richard the Lionheart and to his empire-building father Henry II. Now, this is not necessarily all true, but one of the things that John did have trouble with was holding on to the territories built up by his father in France. Now, it's not a straightforward issue at all, and it's not down to King John's bad behaviour or his incompetence, and no questions asked. Now, under the ruling family that King John came from, the Angevins, England's French possessions reached their greatest territorial extent. So in the period between 1154, the year in which Henry II came to the throne, and 1204, when King John lost Normandy forever, the Angevins controlled a loose confederation of territories within what's modern-day France. And these included Aquitaine, Brittany, Anjou, Normandy and other territories. So they effectively held up sort of between 2/5 and 1/3 of what is now all of France. An area that was actually greater in size than England, and the actual Kingdom of France as it was then was relatively small, much smaller than it is today. Now, already you can imagine that trying to control territories on either side of the English Channel, vast quantities of territory, was going to be a problem for the Angevin kings of England, or at least a logistical nightmare. Now, not all of these territories were held in the same way. In some, like Normandy, the King of England was the direct ruler. So the King of England was Duke of Normandy, and he had been since 1066 and the Norman conquest of England. Now, in other territories, like Brittany, the King of England was simply a loose overlord of the official or the actual ruler of the territory. And that ruler may or may not turn out to be a particularly happy or cooperative or agreeable vassal. So, and controlling all these territories also meant crossing the Channel back and forth regularly. That's dangerous, and it claimed plenty of lives. For instance, back in 1120, the sinking of the White Ship had killed the heir to the English throne and plunged England into civil war. Crossing the Channel also meant that you had to make sure that your government back in England was able to run itself while you were away. So the administrative machinery had to run effectively. Government officials had to be able to do their job and do it properly, particularly your deputy, an officer called the Justiciar of England. You had to develop, or you had to have or be able to develop the finances and the finance systems to allow you to travel constantly, to fight wars, to cross the Channel back and forth, and so on. Now, barons in England, they had to behave themselves at home, and they had to be supportive of your ventures overseas, your attempts to raise money for the armies and so forth. And the church, which was a particularly powerful body in this period and also had a lot of members in English government, also had to be on side. And of course, what happened if people in your French territories rebelled? You had to go over and fight wars, and this was an expensive affair, time-consuming exercise, and you needed to have support from your non-rebelling territories to do this. Now, none of this seemed to be a particularly huge problem for Henry II or indeed Richard the Lionheart, in the sense that they ultimately overcame problems that they did have, and that they did face to retain their French possessions. But it all ended rather horribly for John. It all ended in disaster for John. So by 1204, John had lost Normandy forever to the King of France, bringing not only a loss of prestige, but also a loss of income, and also the loss of lands of barons of his that had territory still in Normandy. This was obviously a problem for them. And the King of France had also started to take away other French territories that had belonged to the English king, had belonged to John. So it didn't just stop at Normandy. Effectively, under John, the Angevin Empire, so-called, we have to use that term with caution, but the Angevin Empire was disintegrating. But if Henry II defeated rebellions, overcame problems with the church, and he had plenty, and ultimately clung on to the territories, a vast empire or vast loose confederation is better, in France, how come John didn't? Well, we might break down some of the reasons into a few categories to make these factors clearer. The first category is John's own mistakes and failings. Some of those worth considering are that he lacked charisma. He didn't have the charisma of his father or brother, and you need charisma to keep up with defence and loyalty, to sort of animate defence, the defence of your territories, to retain the loyalty of your barons and other subjects. And Henry II and Richard I really did have this charisma. John had a tendency to alienate people. This is never a good thing. Now, just after 1200, the year 1200 as well, just after he came to the throne, John signed a peace treaty with the King of France, Philip Augustus. Now, this treaty was called the Peace of Le Goulet, and what it did, among other things, was to give the French king much greater rights over John as Duke of Normandy, and also, therefore, over the Norman territories, over Normandy itself. So in signing this peace, John effectively cemented his inferior position to the King of France when it came to his rule over Normandy. It made Philip look more powerful, and it made John look kind of soft in his subjects' eyes. And of course, in 1202, Philip Augustus, the King of France, used his position to confiscate Normandy, to take it from John as a recalcitrant vassal. Now, there were also rumours circulating that King John had murdered his nephew Arthur in 1203. Now, some people thought that Arthur was the rightful ruler of England, the rightful heir to the English throne, and not John. This, of course, made people wary and distrustful of John, and John was also quite prone to breaking promises and wriggling out of agreements and so forth. So there was generally not a great deal of trust for King John himself, either within England or the British Isles, or indeed abroad. Those are John's personal failings. What we also have, though, is the huge financial cost of controlling the vast French territories. This is, of course, also a problem for John's father, Henry II, and also for his brother, Richard the Lionheart. But in many ways, it became much more burdensome for King John, for a number of reasons that were actually beyond his control. Now, Normandy was under constant pressure from the King of France, who was very keen to get hold of it. And Normandy therefore required the expenditure of a vast amount of money, really considerable sums of money, to pay for its defence. Other English territories in France, like Aquitaine, did not have the surplus cash to help pay for this defence programme. Now, England did, but for several reasons, which we shall see shortly, it was getting more and more difficult to raise this money in England. The cost of defending Normandy was absolutely huge. So, for example, King John had to pay £15,000 to defend Normandy, or to take part in the 1203 campaign, 50% of which was paid for by England directly. Now, if you think £1,500 or £15,000 is a lot today, it was an awful lot in 1203. Now, at the same time, the French resources, the resources of the King of France, were actually growing in scale as the French kings, and particularly Philip Augustus, increased their territories and improved their taxation methods, so improved ways of raising money from their own territories, actually by observing what was going on in England in many ways. Now, in Philip Augustus's territory, there was actually a twofold increase in income between 1180 and 1203. So by 1203, we think King John had about 30% less income than Philip Augustus, his great rival. And this is a hugely different situation from when Henry II was on the throne. Now, England's own financial situation was actually compounded by the fact that there was inflation in England. And there had been inflation since about 1180, and it went through to 1220. So inflation means that your money won't go as far as it used to do. So you can do less with what you've got. This is really significant if you need to raise a lot of money for armies, defence, cross-channel travel, and so forth. And this inflation had begun under Henry II, but King John bore the brunt of it. And, of course, Richard the Lionheart, John's elder brother, had left England with considerable debt because he'd spent an awful lot of money on his crusading ventures overseas. A third factor to consider on top of all of this is John's repeated attempts to get Normandy back, something which actually made the situation at home in England much worse. Almost every year from 1202 till his death in 1216, John either launched an expedition to Normandy, planned one, or half-launched one. And this had an enormous impact on his prestige and so forth at home. Now, John had problems because he was actually dealing with an increasingly able, wealthy and powerful king in France, Philip Augustus. So the balance of wealth and power had tipped a long way since his father was on the throne. As we've seen too, finance was also an issue because John was at the tail end of a considerable period of inflation. And this, coupled with the greater complexity of military technology, made things very, very expensive. But what John did was really turn to intense exploitation of his feudal dues. That's his right to raise money from his subjects and from the church. And he did this to get more and more money, more and more frequently, in a number of different ways. And he often treated people arbitrarily and unfairly. And he found all sorts of new ways or revived old ways of squeezing the last penny out of the people he was trying to exploit. And he made and broke deals and so on. So he generally gave the impression of an untrustworthy and exploitative king. John also lacked baronial support for his ventures. By 1204, few barons in England actually had substantial lands in Normandy anymore, and after 1204, virtually none did. So in October 1204, John confiscated the English lands of those barons who preferred to stay in Normandy. And those barons that preferred to stay in England lost their Norman lands to the French king. So there was essentially a split between those barons who lost Norman lands and just stayed in England, and those few who decided that they preferred Camembert and Calvados. So many barons had very little interest in Normandy at all, and few really were interested in expeditions to France. Expeditions to France sometimes had to be cancelled because magnates failed to show up for the crossing, and in 1214 the northern magnates flatly refused to go to France. That same year, so in 1214, King John was defeated at a battle in France, an important battle called the Battle of Bouvines. It was utterly humiliating and very, very expensive. Now, England was also at risk of being invaded by Philip Augustus, who'd been threatening this for a while. And so England also required considerable expenditure on defence. The threats of Philip Augustus to come and take over England became a problem or remained a problem on and off throughout John's reign. Now, at home, the barons got increasingly disaffected, and John ultimately faced rebellion. So, to cut a long story short, disagreements and tensions between King John and his barons ultimately culminated in the signing of Magna Carta in 1215. So in 1215, King John was required to put his signature to a document called Magna Carta, or Great Charter, which sought to curb his arbitrary taxation and all sorts of other misbehaviours. This meant that he could no longer raise money in the way that he'd been doing, money that he really needed in increasing quantities. So King John's wings had been clipped, and although he did manage to wriggle out of some of these sort of strictures and so forth placed upon him, he lost further prestige and room for movement. King John died of dysentery in October 1216, having never managed to regain his French losses. His troubles were almost certainly down to a mixture of factors, all working on and interacting with each other, and not just down to one individual factor. Nor are the issues outlined above exhaustive. Historians are still debating today the reasons for John's troubles. John's son and heir, Henry III, continued to try to get Normandy back. But by 1259, he had acknowledged that this and other French territories were gone for good.